Do you believe that a completely destroyed life can be restored only by faith? What if I told you that a man sunk in addiction, rejected by his family and discredited by everyone, found his way back when he decided to cry out to God? This is not just another story. It is a real testimony, one that moves the soul, that makes us stop and think, am I trusting God as I should? Many people think they have seen it all, but what you will hear now will make you rethink about the power of transformation, about the miracle that happens when human beings reach the end of the line and God decides to act. This story does not begin with a victory, much less with an unshakable faith. It starts with destruction, pain, sleepless nights, and an empty heart. How many times have you felt at rock bottom? No direction, no strength, no purpose. Maybe even today you are facing something like this. Addiction may have another name in your life: depression, loneliness, debt, rejection. But the feeling is the same, an endless hole, a feeling that nothing makes sense anymore. The protagonist of this story also believed that there was no way out, tried everything: clinics, promises, help from friends, but nothing filled the void that grew inside him, until, in the middle of a cold and silent dawn, he did something different. Prayed. Yes, he spoke to God in a simple way, the way he knew how. And there on the floor, dirty, destroyed, God heard. Because that's what he does. He listens to the broken, the lost, the one who no longer has the strength to try alone. It is in these moments that the miracle begins. This video is for you who need to see that there is still hope, that there is still a cure, that God does not give up on anyone, not even those who the entire world has already abandoned. This is the story of a divine turnaround, living proof that God turns ashes into new life, tears into purpose, and addiction into testimony. Are you ready to see what God can do when we truly surrender? So stay with me until the end, because what happened after that prayer, no one could have imagined. Now you will understand how it all started. But before continuing, I need to tell you something very serious. We are living in times where lives are being destroyed in silence. People are losing themselves every day, dominated by addictions, anxiety, loneliness, and worse, not knowing there is a way out. This is why testimonies like this need to be spread urgently. They are not just exciting stories. They are signs of God's actions in the last days. Have you noticed how many tragedies have multiplied? How many are dying spiritually without ever having heard that there is hope in Christ? It's no longer possible to remain silent. Each video like this is a tool to open eyes, touch hearts, and prepare lives for what's to come. So, if this content has touched you this far, don't wait for the end of the video. Now is the time. Leave your like. This helps YouTube understand that this message needs to reach more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because real stories like this come out every week, and each one of them could be exactly what someone needs to hear to keep them from giving up. The truth is that we are in a race against time, and you can be part of this mission to spread faith, hope, and salvation. Shall we go together until the end of this story? Because now you will see how God began to change everything. Lucas was just 23 years old. He dreamed of being a musician. He had a family that loved him, but a mistake put him on a path of no return. He grew up in a Christian home, one of those where Sunday was sacred, prayer before dinner was a routine, and the Bible, more than a book, was a foundation. Even so, as the years passed, Lucas felt a restlessness within him, something that no prayer seemed to calm. Behind the smile he showed everyone, there was a young man fighting a silent battle, a war against the feeling of not being enough. Since he was little, he believed that music would be his path. He spent hours with his guitar, composing lyrics that spoke of pain and hope. I dreamed of going on stage, moving crowds, making a living from art. But the world has no pity on those who dream too much. When he decided to drop out of college to pursue his purpose as a musician, he faced disapproving looks, even at home. The support he expected did not come. On the contrary, he heard he was throwing his life away. That hurt him more than he was capable of admitting. It was then that in a moment of desperation, he accepted an invitation to play at a nightclub. It wasn't the style he liked, nor the environment he had dreamed of, but it was a stage, and he thought, if I don't start somewhere, I'll never get there. The problem is that over time, Lucas didn't just start playing in these places. He started living in them. Early mornings became routine, alcohol, an anesthetic for the emptiness that grew inside. The music, once so pure and full of purpose, was now just a sound drowned out by empty applause. Little by little, he moved away from his family. Invitations to Sunday lunches were ignored. The mother's messages, who always said, "Son, God still has a plan for you," went unanswered. Luke didn't want to hear about God. How could he trust a God who apparently had remained silent when he needed it most? He felt like he was alone, as if he had been left to his own devices. Debts began to accumulate. The doors closed one by one, friends disappeared, and the stage, which was once his dream, became a prison. It was as if, with every note he played, he was burying his own identity. Until one night, everything collapsed once and for all. An argument with the bar owner, a payment that didn't come, and a threat that made him run through the streets, aimlessly, with his heart racing and his spirit in pieces. He sat on the sidewalk of a deserted street, with his eyes teary, his body shaking, and the guitar, his constant companion, lying on the ground beside him. It was at that moment that he whispered, "God, if you still hear me, give me a sign. I can't take it anymore." It was a simple prayer, almost a sigh, but she was sincere, and that's when things start to change, not magically, not with a light coming from the sky, but with something subtle and transformative. A stranger approached, a simple man with a Bible in his hand and a look full of compassion. He sat down next to Lucas and, without asking anything, just said, "Son, you are not alone. God never stopped being with you. He still has a plan." Lucas froze. How did that man know? Who was he? Why did it appear at that moment? The man handed over a paper with a hand-scribbled verse. "Call to me, and I will answer you, and I will tell you great and sure things that you do not know." Jeremiah 33:3. Lucas didn't know what to make of it, but something burned inside him. It was as if those words had been written especially for him. That night, instead of returning home, Lucas looked for a temple. He sat on the last bench and for the first time in a long time cried. He cried like a lost child who finally finds his way back. And you? Have you ever had a moment like this, when it seemed like everything was lost, but something unexpected touched your soul? If you've experienced something similar, leave it here in the comments. Your story may be exactly what someone else needs to have. Hope today, because testimonies are not just stories, they are seeds, and seeds, when shared, generate fruits of faith and transformation. You know, life sometimes takes us down paths so far from our purpose that we forget who we are. That's what happened to Lucas. He let himself be carried away by the pain of rejection, by the absence of support, by the unfulfilled promises of the world. But even in the worst moments, God never left the scene. He was just waiting for space to act. And when Lucas finally opened a breach, even if timidly, even if broken, the sky moved. This story, which has touched us so much so far, still has moments that will move you in a profound way. Because what comes next is a testimony of transformation so powerful that many say, if I hadn't heard, I wouldn't believe it. But before that, think with me. How many people do you know who are lost today, hurt by wrong decisions, suffocated by their own choices? How many are on the verge of collapse, needing just a word, a gesture, a response from God? Perhaps by sharing this story, you are being the channel through which this answer will arrive. Have you thought about that? What for you is just a click, a comment, could be the confirmation that someone prayed for. So I invite you, comment below with a word of faith. It may be a simple phrase, God still has a plan, but believe me, it can heal someone. And stay with me, because what happened after that night when Luke entered that temple is something that only God's actions could explain. You will understand that the miracle is not only in what God does, but in what he rebuilds inside, where no one else can reach. The next chapter of this journey will show you that not even the thickest darkness can erase the purpose that God wrote for your life. And if you think you've seen everything so far, just wait until you hear what happened next. But what seemed like a simple, innocent habit soon turned into a prison without bars. Lucas, once a promising young man, full of dreams and hope in his eyes, began to lose himself in small but dangerous choices. What began as an attempt to escape the pain, loneliness, and emptiness he carried inside his chest ended up opening doors to an increasingly deeper abyss. Casual use has become a necessity. Need turned to desperation, and despair, when it does not find support, ends up pushing even the strongest people into the darkest places of the soul. Little by little, everything he had began to slip through his fingers like sand. Friends, they walked away. Family, they no longer knew what to do. Job, it lost. Dignity. This one seemed to have been ripped from his heart every morning spent on dirty sidewalks, hungry, cold, and afraid. Lucas was now just another face among so many invisible ones around the city, a body lying among cardboard, trying to forget that he once had a home. People hurried past, looking away. To the world, he was a failure. To himself, he was a mistake. And the worst prison wasn't the drug prison. It was a prison of regret, shame, and the unbearable feeling that God had given up on him. There were many nights without sleeping, without eating, just listening to your own thoughts screaming, hammering your mind with lies. You will never get out of this. Nobody cares about you. Not even God is listening to you. These voices, fueled by guilt and abandonment, were crueler than any substance he had ever tried. And even though he tried to fool himself with one more dose, one more drink, deep down he knew he was dying inside. The soul no longer had color. It no longer had hope. There was only pain. And perhaps worst of all is the silence. Because when we are at rock bottom, waiting for some hand to reach us, silence weighs heavily. It weighs more than hunger, more than the cold. Because in the silence doubt whispers, has God abandoned me for good? Maybe you who are watching now have felt this too, that feeling of being in the middle, of chaos, with no direction, with no one. You pray, but it seems like heaven is closed. You cry out, but hear no answer. Have you been through this? Have you ever felt that silence from God that hurts more than any scream? Lucas felt it, and each step seemed to take him further away from any hope of a fresh start. I had nowhere else to sleep, nor anyone to call. He couldn't even look at himself in the mirror anymore. The reflected image was of someone destroyed, injured, unrecognizable. And the heart. Oh, the heart was broken. He remembered the moments when his life still made sense, when he believed in the future. But now, all he saw in front of him was darkness. And it was into this darkness that he fell. He fell to his knees, not because he wanted to pray, but because he no longer had the strength to stand. The street was his home, and the sidewalk his altar of despair. With his face wet with tears and his soul crushed by the weight of shame, he screamed, a muffled scream, almost. Soundless, but that came from the depths of his being. God, if the Lord is still there, get me out of here. And perhaps you think, but does God hear anyone in this situation? Does he respond to a cry so weak, so impure, so late? And this is where the story begins to change. But not yet, because before the miracle, there is silence. There is the desert. In the following days, nothing changed on the outside. He was still on the street, still no money, still hungry. But something small had changed inside, a spark, a seed, something he couldn't explain, but that prevented him from using it again. Something that made him lift his head and look up at the sky, not with anger but with expectation. And it was in this space between despair and faith that God began to act. No fuss, no noise, but with purpose. It's curious how God often allows us to reach the end of ourselves to understand that He is the beginning of everything. And Lucas didn't know it yet, but that prayer whispered, between tears was heard. And if you've made it this far in this video, maybe it's because, like him, you're also looking for an answer, a sign, a way out. Maybe you're also trying to understand what to do when everything falls apart, when resources run out, when people turn their backs on you. Maybe you are tired of fighting in your own strength. And if that's your case, stay with me, because what God did in Lucas's life can transform yours too. But tell me here in the comments, have you ever had a moment when you felt that God was silent? Have you ever reached the point where you think there is no way out? I really want to read your story, because sometimes, just by telling, we begin to heal. And who knows, maybe your comment here might be the beginning of your miracle too. That night, the cold seemed to pierce the soul. He was huddled in the corner of an empty room, with his hands shaking, his heart heavy, and his mind immersed in thoughts as dark as the darkness that surrounded him. The silence was piercing. There were no more voices of encouragement, no more phone calls, not even notifications on the cell phone. All he heard was the echo of his own breathing, becoming more and more irregular, as if the weight of life was sinking into his chest. It was the end of the line. The business he had fought for years had collapsed like a house of cards. Debts knocked on the door like relentless collectors, and shame prevented him from seeking help. Friends moved away. Even though his family was present, they could no longer reach him. What hurt most was not the financial loss. It was the feeling of failure, the total absence of direction, and that question that tormented the soul. God, where are you? He tried to resist, tried to keep the faith, but the pain was accumulating, piling up like rubble in the soul. And that night, he really thought about ending it all. He thought that perhaps the only way out was eternal silence. But before he could do anything, something inside him imploded. It wasn't courage, it wasn't hope, it was pure desperation. He fell to his knees, her eyes, already dry from crying, filled with tears once again. And there, with the last breath, he murmured, God, if you really exist, if you still see me, take me out of here. Save me, because I don't know how to live anymore. The words came out as a stifled lament, but something different happened in that instant. A slight shiver ran down his spine, and even without explanation, he felt like he was no longer alone in that room. There was still no light, there was still no answer, but there was something new, a presence, a different silence, full of meaning. And at this moment, dear viewer, I ask you honestly, have you ever felt this way? Have you ever had a moment when it seems like everything inside you is screaming for help, but the world remains indifferent? Have you ever looked at the sky without strength, waiting for a sign that God is still there? Maybe you are living this right now. Maybe this video is not just another story, but an answer that your heart was begging to hear. Because there, in that dark room, It wasn't his strength that started to change the situation. It was the brokenness. It was the outcry. It was that whisper between tears that opened a gap in the sky. Sometimes the miracle doesn't start with lights and angels. It begins with a desperate soul, crying out from the depths of the abyss. And so, I want to ask you something. If this part of the story touched you in any way, if it reminded you of something you've already experienced, or even if you feel like you're living it now, comment below. Write, "I have already cried out," or "I am waiting on God." Your comment could be the start of a conversation that will bring healing to someone. It may be exactly what someone else needed to see to understand that they are not alone. Let's transform this comment section into an altar of testimonies, a place of comfort and faith. Do you agree? As he remained there on the cold floor of that room, memories began to return to his mind like a film of pain. The days when he dreamed big, the smiles when he signed his first contract, the promises he made to his family, of a better life, of stability, of pride. And now he only had silence and bankruptcy. But at that moment, even without seeing anything change on the outside, he began to notice something inside him, a strength that didn't come from him, a consolation that was not human. The Bible says that the Lord is near to those who are broken-hearted, Psalm 34:18, and that's exactly what he experienced. God was there. It wasn't the end, even though it seemed like it, but there was something moving in the unseen, something that only reveals itself to those who reach the breaking point. This is the exact point where God acts. It's when everything falls apart that he rebuilds it his way. And it is in this type of situation that testimonies are born. Testimonies that cannot be explained logically, that do not fit into human formulas. Testimonies that begin with tears in the dark, but end with miracles in the light of day. And look, if you've made it this far in this video, maybe it's because you need to remember that too. Or maybe God used this story to find you where you are now. It's no coincidence. Nothing God does is by chance. He sees you, he listens, and he acts. Even if everything seems like ruin now, a fresh start may be closer than you think. It is difficult to explain in words what happens at the breaking point. There is a mixture of pain, longing for God, shame, fear of the future, and an absurd desire to simply disappear. But it is in this cauldron of emotions that something divine begins to boil. It's as if God said, "Now yes, now you understand that it is not by your strength. Now I can act." And that's exactly how the change began. In the next few seconds you will see how, without him expecting it, a door began to open. And it wasn't just any door. It was one of those that only God can unlock. But before I tell you what happened, answer me in the comments. Do you believe that God still performs miracles? Have you ever experienced something that can only be explained as a response from him? Share with me. I read everything. And sometimes a simple comment becomes part of a chain of faith that changes stories. Now hold on tight, because what happened next will shake you. That same freezing dawn, when silence seemed to mock Lucas's pain, something that human eyes couldn't see began to move. He was huddled in the corner of an almost deserted square, surrounded by darkness, cold, and thoughts that seemed to scream louder than any car horn or dog bark in the distance. His hands were shaking, but it wasn't just from the biting wind. It was fear. The fear of not having another tomorrow, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that not even God was listening. But just when everything seemed lost, when every last thread of hope was breaking, God responded, and it was not with thunder nor with voices from heaven. It was a simple gesture, but impossible to ignore. A man appeared out of nowhere. He was walking slowly, with a Bible under his arm, towards the church that was a few meters away. It was as if he knew exactly where to step, as if each step was being guided. When his eyes met Lucas's, he stopped. He remained motionless for a few seconds, observing the scene that for many would go unnoticed, but for him, no. He approached without hesitation. Lucas raised his head, surprised. The man bent down and in a firm but compassionate voice said, "God sent me here for you." In that instant, it was as if time had stopped. The tears that Lucas was trying to hold back began to flow. It was as if all the weight he carried was being exposed, dismantled by a simple sentence. He didn't know who that man was. I had never seen him before, but he felt something different. A heat, a peace he didn't even remember existed. The man reached out his hand and helped him up. There was no rush, no judgments. There was just presence. And in that human contact, in that tight embrace in the middle of the night, Lucas felt that God was there. Not distant, not silent, but present, responding in a real, tangible way, through someone who obeyed the leading of the Spirit. As the man spoke, Lucas heard words that seemed to have been written for him. It wasn't generic advice. It was direction. It was revelation. You thought it was the end, but God is just beginning. He saw you that day in the car, crying. He heard you when you silently screamed for help. He is here now to show you that the time of restoration has come. It was as if the sky had torn apart for a moment, as if the promises of God, which seemed buried, were being unearthed one by one before your eyes. Lucas collapsed. I couldn't hold it anymore. He cried like a child who finds his father after being lost. And in that cry, there was liberation. It was as if all the hurt, frustration, and guilt were being ripped from my chest. And the most incredible thing, he no longer felt ashamed. I felt relief. I felt hope. That was the fresh start. There, in the middle of the street, faced with a stranger sent by God, Lucas began to understand that faith is not the absence of struggles, but the certainty of presence. And that, even when we think God is silent, he is already acting. That night marked the beginning of a radical transformation. The man took him to the church. There, Lucas was welcomed as someone who was returning home. During the prayer, he could not hold back his tears. Something was breaking inside him. Invisible chains were breaking. He felt it. You knew. It was the Holy Spirit working where no one else could touch. And on that improvised altar, without a microphone, without an audience, Lucas truly gave his life to God. It wasn't a pretty speech, it was a sincere cry. Lord, I have nothing left, but if the Lord still wants me, take all of me. And that's when the divine response became a miracle. Have you ever had the feeling that God is taking time? What does he no longer hear about? Lucas too. But that night, he discovered that God is never late. He just waits for the right moment to act, the one when there is no longer any pride, when the heart is broken enough to be molded. And maybe you are at that exact point right now. Perhaps you are also asking for an answer, a sign, and I ask you, what if this story is the answer you're waiting for? What if God is using this video to remind you that he sees you? Comment here if this part spoke to you, if it seems like it was written for your life. Sometimes all we need is a reminder that we are not alone, that there is a God who still performs miracles, that responds, what transforms, and that uses ordinary people to touch broken hearts. And it was like this, in a simple way, almost imperceptible to natural eyes, that the turning point began. From that moment on, Lucas would no longer be the same. He still didn't have all the answers. He still didn't know what would come next, but something inside him had changed. The faith that was weak before was now lit like a flame. He realized he didn't need to understand everything, just trust. And it was there, in that place of total surrender, that the impossible began to become possible. Divine intervention had begun. God was acting. And what came next? You won't believe it. It was as if something had finally ignited within him. It was no ordinary fire. It was like an old ember which had been hidden for so long under the ashes of pain, loss, guilt. But now, fueled by prayer, it began to burn again. Lucas, that same man who weeks before could barely look at himself in the mirror, was now on his knees, but no longer in despair, but in surrender. Every tear that ran down her face that silent dawn in the halfway house was a release. He no longer cried for what he lost, but for having survived this far, for God still giving him breath, even when he had already given up on you. In that simple environment, surrounded by other men marked by falls and stories of pain, Lucas began to be rebuilt. Faith took root little by little, not as something magical and instantaneous, but as a daily construction. He learned to fast, even when his body cried out for old vices. He learned to read the Word, even when his mind was too confused to understand it all. And he learned above all to listen to the voice of God. Not that audible voice that many expect, but the whisper that calms the heart, that gives direction in the chaos, that says, "Son, I never abandoned you." Before long, something in Lucas visibly changed. The eyes no longer carried the weight of despair, but began to shine with hope. Shoulders once hunched with guilt, now lifted in gratitude. He, who arrived at that place as another name lost in the statistics of failure, began to become an example. And this was not because of human merit, but because of a restored faith. A faith that not only sustained, but drove. He began to help the other inmates, with words, with simple gestures, with sincere prayers. It was as if every scar in his history had become a point of support for healing other people's wounds. And you know what's most incredible? Lucas didn't just get up. He was called. He was called to something greater. It didn't take long for the halfway house leaders to notice the gift in his speech, the authority that was born not of theology but of experience. He knew rock bottom, and even more so, he now knew who had pulled him out. And this gave his words a weight that no theory could produce. People listened, they cried, they surrendered, because they saw there before them a living miracle. Lucas began to preach. At first, just inside the house, then in partner churches, and what he said was simple, direct, and profound. God found me when I had nothing left, and if he did it to me, he can do it to anyone. There was no technique, but there was truth. There was no performance, but there was anointing. And that was what touched people, because everyone at some point feels like Lucas felt. Alone, with no way out, tired of fighting. Everyone at some level needs to see that there is still a fresh start. And Lucas was that new beginning incarnate. Maybe you're wondering now, how does someone go from rock bottom to the pulpit? How can a destroyed life become a reference of hope? There is only one answer: God. It was neither personal motivation nor coincidence. It was divine intervention. And this same intervention still happens today. It still transforms, still restores. It still calls those the world gave up on. Lucas did not become a pastor by choice. It was by calling. And even he often thought he wasn't worthy. But God does not choose the capable. He empowers those he chooses. And it was in this process that the transformation was complete. Lucas dreamed again. He came back to live. He rebuilt ties with his family, rediscovered his dignity, recovered the joy in simple things, like waking up in the morning without fear, like walking down the street with his head held high. The man who once thought about ending his own life now spoke about life with authority. Every cult he led was charged with power. Every statement I told brought tears, because it was impossible to listen and not see yourself in some way in that story. Have you ever wondered how far God can take you if you give everything? Have you ever imagined what could happen if, instead of trying to solve everything yourself, you just surrendered? Maybe you are there right now, feeling like nothing makes sense. Maybe you're tired of fighting, tired of waiting for answers, feeling like your faith is too weak to continue. But look, it was in this exact state that Lucas was when everything started to change. And maybe, just maybe, this video came to you for a purpose, because God does not forget. He sees, He listens, He acts. And now I need to ask you something. What about you? Have you truly given your problems into God's hands? Have you ever had that moment of total surrender, where all that's left is to trust? Comment below with just one word: I trust. Let us together declare that even when all seems lost, there is still hope, because faith is precisely that, believing when everything around says it is impossible. And if you felt something while watching this far, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share with someone who needs to hear this today. And if you haven't signed up yet, now is the time. There are a lot of stories like this coming out, and each one of them carries something that can change your life. But you think it's over. Just wait until you hear what happened when Luke decided to take an even bolder step in faith. What God did next was something even he could not imagine. Sometimes, all we can do is look up. When Lucas fell to his knees that morning, he no longer had any strength or plans. All that was left was an outcry. The silence of the house contrasted with the noise inside, a whirlwind of doubts, pain, and memories of everything he lost. But it was in that silence, exactly at that moment when the world seemed to have given up on him, that something began to change. Because when man is silent, God speaks. And it was there, kneeling on the cold ground, that Lucas uttered the most sincere words of his life. God, if you still hear me, please show me that the Lord has not forgotten me. And it was as if the sky responded in a subtle but impossible to ignore way. A verse came to mind, as if whispered straight to the heart. Call to me, and I will answer you, and I will tell you great and hidden things that you do not know. Jeremiah 33:3. That was no coincidence. It was an answer. That morning, something inside him was different. There was still no money. In the account, the problems had not evaporated, but God's presence began to be felt in a new way. Peace no longer depended on circumstances. It was as if heaven was saying, I am with you, even if everything says otherwise. And this feeling pushed him to do something he hadn't done in a long time: start over. Lucas looked for a nearby church, one of those simple ones without large structures, but with people who know the power of prayer. He entered, sat in the last pew, and before the service even began, a man next to him placed his hand on his shoulder and said, God told me to tell you that the time of mourning is over. A new time will begin. Lucas couldn't hold back the tears. How could that man know? It was God. It could only be. The following days were marked by small miracles. A friend he hadn't seen in years reappeared and recommended him for temporary work. The same company that had dismissed him months earlier was now looking for him for consultancy. But more than that, the biggest transformation was internal. Lucas began to wake up with a new meaning, with a burning desire to seek the presence of God daily. The Word became food, prayer, a refuge, and the pain, although it still existed, was no longer the center of his life. Because when God enters, even pain bends. You know, maybe you who are watching this video are experiencing something similar. You may be tired of trying in your own strength. Maybe you've done everything, sought help, advice, tried to control every detail, but everything remains out of place. And it is at this point that surrender turns into a miracle. Luke is just one example among many who chose to give control to God when there was nothing left. And it was precisely in this delivery that the transformation began. If you have ever felt that God was silent, if you have ever prayed without seeing an answer, if you have ever cried in secret thinking that no one understands what you are going through, then this story is for you. Because God still speaks, still acts, it still transforms. And maybe, just like he did with Luke, he is using this video right now to talk to you. Believe, the same God who lifted that man off the ground, who restored his dignity and gave him a new purpose, is the God who is calling you today to trust, to stop fighting alone, to understand that a miracle is not a reward of merit, but a response of faith. Lucas's life turned a page that seemed torn, that deep wound which prevented him from dreaming again was being stitched together by grace, one step at a time, one prayer a day, a sincere delivery. This is how he discovered what it really means to trust God. It's not feeling like everything is fine, it's knowing that even when everything seems to fall apart, he is still in control. And that changes everything. You know what's most incredible? It wasn't the amount of money that came back, nor the doors that opened. It was Lucas's look, now full of light. It was the peace that no one else understood, but he carried. It was the strength of someone who learned to depend, not on their own arm, but on the hand that never fails. His life became a living testimony that God does not need ideal conditions to act. He needs an available heart. And now I want to ask you, have you ever had this moment? That moment when everything inside you screams for an answer, for direction, for a miracle. Have you ever reached your limit and felt like you couldn't do it anymore? If yes, then you are in the right place, because maybe today is the day of your fresh start. Maybe God is using this story to remind you that it's not too late, that there is still a way, that still has purpose, and more than that He is seeing you now. Share with us here in the comments which part of this story touched your heart the most. Sometimes what you write may be the answer to the prayer of someone else reading it. Do not underestimate the power of a testimony, a word, a confession of faith. God uses simple things to perform extraordinary miracles. And this space here is not just a channel, it is a place of encounter with the supernatural. If you haven't signed up yet, take advantage of this moment to be part of this community that grows every day. A community that believes in the power of transformation, in God's actions, and in the miracles that still happen. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and keep following the next stories. Because every testimony is a reminder, God is alive, and He still writes surprising endings. Now take a deep breath, because what comes next will shake you even more. And if you thought you've seen what God can do, wait until you hear the next testimony. You will understand why, sometimes, God's answer arrives at the moment we least expect it, but at the exact time we need it most. If this story spoke to you, if something inside your heart moved while listening to what God did in Lucas's life, then you are not here by chance. God brought you to this video because He has something to say to you too. And if you felt this, I invite you to be part of this journey of faith with us. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell, because every week we have real transformative testimonies that prove that God still acts and can act in your life too. And if you made it this far, I want to know, which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave the sentence in the comments, God still works miracles. This way we will know that you stayed until the end, were touched by this message, and are walking with us on this mission of spreading faith, hope, and renewal. Your comment could be the spark of faith someone needed today. Let's go together. And you know what's even stronger? The next story we will share here on the channel reveals a deliverance that seemed impossible. A woman was about to lose everything, including her own life. But divine intervention changed the course of history in a way that no one expected. What happened to her will show you that heaven is never indifferent to the cry of a broken heart. Get ready to see how God acts in the details and transforms tragedies into testimonies of power and restoration. You will understand that when everything seems out of control, that is exactly when God shows that control has always been His.